blood stains the winter snow a brilliant crimson, but not as deeply as betrayal stains a shattered soul. Before Genevieve was worshipped as a queen, she was a discarded commodity. Priced at 3 measly copper coins and a rusted dagger, her own family threw her to the most vicious predator in the realm, praying the northern winter would finally devour her. They called him the Butcher of Ethelgard, an alpha king whose heart had frozen solid a decade ago. No one expected him to pay her debts, and absolutely no one expected this ruthless, blood-soaked monster to eventually fall to his knees for the frail, broken girl the entire kingdom had laughed at. Rain lashed against the cobblestones of Oakhaven's central square, washing away the grime of the market, but doing nothing to cleanse the rot within the pack. Genevieve shivered, her thin, tattered linen dress clinging to her bruised skin. Iron shackles bit into her wrists, heavy and freezing, chaining her to the wooden post of the tribute block. She was 20 years old, yet her wolf had never surfaced. In the brutal hierarchy of the lycanthrope nobility, a wolfless female was worse than a peasant. She was a curse. Adding to her shame was the treason of her late father, Lord Archibald. Now, her cruel stepfather, Reginald, and her golden-haired stepsister, Diana, stood comfortably beneath a velvet canopy, auctioning off the last remnants of Archibald's estate to pay off their mounting gambling debts. Genevieve was the final lot. "Do I hear 2 coppers for the traitor's runt?" Reginald sneered, his voice magically amplified to carry over the jeering crowd. He took a sip of spiced wine, looking down at Genevieve with unmasked disgust. She cannot shift, she is terribly frail, but she can scrub floors. She can empty chamber pots. Do I hear 2 coppers? Laughter erupted from the gathered alphas, betas, and wealthy merchants of the southern reaches. Genevieve kept her eyes fixed on the muddy wooden planks beneath her bare feet. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron, refusing to let them see her cry. Diana tossed an apple core at her, striking Genevieve's shoulder. "Come now, father," Diana mocked, her voice dripping with venom. "Even 2 coppers is too steep. Perhaps give her away to the tanners. They could use her skin for cheap boots." "1 copper!" yelled a bloated beta from the back, a man known for running the local brothels into the ground. Genevieve closed her eyes, praying to the moon goddess for a swift end. Suddenly, the temperature in the square plummeted. The torrential rain turned to sleet, then to sharp, biting snow in the span of a single heartbeat. The jeering died in the throats of the southerners as a heavy, suffocating aura washed over the square. It was the scent of frost, crushed pine needles and fresh blood. An alpha's aura, but magnified to an agonizing degree. Several lesser wolves in the crowd instantly dropped to their knees, clutching their throats as their lungs seized under the crushing dominance. The heavy oak gates of the market square splintered inward. Riding a monstrous destrier black as midnight was Caelan Blackwood, the alpha king of the north, the winter wolf. He was a terrifying spectacle. Standing well over 6.5 feet tall, his broad shoulders were draped in the thick, silver-tipped fur of a dire wolf he had slain with his bare hands. Black iron armor clung to his chest, etched with ancient, forgotten runes. His face was all sharp angles and harsh lines, dominated by a pair of eyes so pale blue they looked like chipped ice. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the war that had forged his legend. "Lord Reginald!" Caelan's voice boomed, deep and resonant, vibrating through the chest cavities of everyone present. "You owe the Northern Crown 50,000 gold pieces, a debt that is 3 moons overdue." Reginald paled, dropping his goblet. The spiced wine spilled across the canopy floor like blood. "King Caelan, we did not expect you. The roads, the storms. I do not care for your excuses, Reginald," Caelan interrupted, dismounting. His heavy iron-shod boots crunched against the freezing mud. His royal guard, massive warriors clad in dark steel, fanned out behind him, hands resting menacingly on the pommels of their broadswords. "I have come to collect. Gold, territory, or blood. Choose." Reginald's hands trembled violently. The southern packs were bankrupt, entirely ruined by his own mismanagement. "My king, I beg of you, give me another fortnight. We have nothing of value left today. We are auctioning off the very dregs of the estate." He gestured wildly toward Genevieve on the block. "See, only trash remains." Calen slowly turned his piercing, icy gaze toward the wooden platform. Genevieve held her breath. When his pale eyes locked onto hers, a strange jolt shot through her chest, sharp and electrical, unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't the crushing weight of an alpha trying to submit her. It was a bizarre, humming resonance. Calen froze. His nostrils flared slightly, taking in her scent beneath the rain and mud. Diana, desperate to save her father from the butcher's blade, ran to the edge of the canopy. "Your Majesty, if it is blood you seek, take the runt. She is Genevieve, daughter of a traitor. Kill her to settle the blood debt. We offer her to you." Genevieve's heart plummeted into her stomach. They were handing her over for execution. Calen stared at Genevieve's shivering, bruised form. He took in the heavy iron chains cutting into her delicate wrists, the dirt on her cheek, the sheer, terrified defiance in her hazel eyes. "Her," Calen murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet timbre. "Yes." Reginald latched onto the lifeline. "She is the last of the Hastings bloodline. Take her life, wipe the slate clean. She is entirely useless anyway. Wolfless. Broken." Calen slowly ascended the steps of the auction block. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the massive broadsword at his hip to cleave her head from her shoulders. Instead, she heard the sickening crack of metal. She opened her eyes to see Calen had gripped the thick iron chain binding her to the post and snapped it with one bare, gauntleted hand. He didn't draw his sword. He shrugged off his massive, heavy fur cloak. With surprising gentleness, Calen draped the heavy, warm fur over Genevieve's trembling shoulders. The scent of him, pine, snow, and something distinctly masculine, enveloped her, instantly chasing away the bone-deep chill. Calen turned back to a stunned Reginald. "The debt is settled," Calen announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I am taking the girl." "You accept her life in exchange for the gold?" Reginald asked, baffled. "I did not say I was taking her life," Calen replied coldly, lifting Genevieve effortlessly into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a sparrow. "I am taking her, and if anyone in this wretched city ever speaks her name with disrespect again, I will return and burn Oakhaven to the ash it deserves to be." The ride north was a nightmare of ice and jagged stone. Genevieve rode at the center of the royal vanguard, perched entirely upon Calen's monstrous black warhorse, seated just in front of the Alpha King himself. For 3 days, they had ridden in near total silence. Genevieve was stiff with terror. Despite the heavy cloak he had given her, she was deeply convinced she was riding toward a fate worse than death. Why would the Winter Wolf, a man who possessed unimaginable wealth and terrifying power, accept a wolfless reject to settle a massive debt? The rumors in the south said Calen Blackwood performed dark blood magic, sacrificing wolves to keep his lands fertile in the harsh winter. She must be the sacrifice. "You are shaking!" A deep rumble vibrated against her back. Calen's chest was a solid wall of muscle behind her. "I am fine, Your Majesty," Genevieve lied, her teeth chattering. Calen's massive arm, which had been loosely holding the reins on either side of her, tightened slightly, pulling her flush against his armored chest. The radiant heat coming off his lichen body was astounding. "Do not lie to me, Genevieve. It is a useless endeavor. I can hear your heartbeat." It was the first time he had spoken her name. It sounded strange on his tongue, heavy, deliberate, almost possessive. "Why am I here?" she blurted out, the anxiety finally boiling over. The howling wind whipped her dark hair across her face. "If you are going to kill me for a ritual, I would rather you do it now. Please, do not drag it out." Kaelin pulled back on the reins, bringing the massive warhorse to a halt. The entire vanguard stopped instantly behind them. He leaned down, his face so close to hers that his warm breath brushed her cold ear. "Who told you such foolishness?" he demanded, his tone dangerously soft. "Everyone," she whispered. "They say you are the butcher. They say you drink the blood of the weak." A low, vibrating growl rumbled in Kaelin's throat. It wasn't directed at her, but rather at the memories of the Southerners. Southern fools speak of things they do not understand to mask their own cowardice. I am a killer, yes. I have slaughtered armies. But I do not harm the innocent, and I certainly do not sacrifice women. "Then why?" she pleaded, turning her head slightly to look up at his scarred profile. "I have no wolf. I have no dowry. I am broken." Kaelin looked down at her, his icy eyes catching the fading twilight. For a fleeting second, an emotion crossed his face, something akin to agonizing pain, before the thick ice walled it back up. "You are not broken, little bird. You are simply planted in the wrong soil." Before Genevieve could process his cryptic words, Kaelin's head snapped up. His pupils blew wide, consuming the pale blue of his irises until his eyes were pitch black. "Ambush!" shouted his lead beta, a giant of a man named Cedric, drawing twin axes. From the snow-draped tree line bordering the icy pass, arrows rained down upon them. Silver-tipped shafts struck the frozen earth, hissing as the lethal metal touched the snow. A horrific howl shattered the evening quiet as dozens of massive, feral wolves burst from the woods. "Dominic's mercenaries!" Kaelin snarled, referring to the ruthless alpha of the eastern borderlands, who had long sought to claim the north. Kaelin threw himself off the horse, pulling Genevieve down with him. He shoved her behind a large, snow-covered boulder, just as a silver arrow embedded itself in the saddle, where she had been sitting a second prior. "Stay here," Kaelin commanded, his voice already dropping an octave as his bones began to brutally shift and crack. "Do not move, Genevieve. Do not make a sound." She watched in absolute terror and awe as the King of the North shifted. It was an explosive, violent transformation. Where the tall, armored man had stood, a gargantuan wolf now crouched. He was impossibly huge, easily the size of a carriage, with fur as black as a starless night, and eyes glowing with terrifying, ethereal blue fire. The mercenaries, still in their human forms, wielding silver weapons, charged the vanguard. Kaelin didn't wait. The massive black wolf launched himself into the fray. He was a force of pure, untamed destruction. He tore through the mercenaries with brutal efficiency, his massive jaws snapping silver broadswords as if they were twigs. He moved with a speed that defied his sheer size, a blur of dark fur and crimson blood against the pristine white snow. Genevieve pressed her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes tightly against the carnage. The sounds of tearing flesh and dying screams echoed in the icy ravine. She had been taught all her life that violence was barbaric, that true nobility lay in court politics and whispered secrets. But as she peeked through her fingers, watching Kaelin rip the throat out of an assassin who had been sneaking toward her boulder, she didn't feel disgust. She felt protected. For the first time in her miserable life, someone was fighting for her. The skirmish was over in minutes. The snow was painted red. The surviving mercenaries fled into the woods, howling in terror. Kaelin, still in his monstrous wolf form, turned back toward the boulder. His muzzle was stained with blood, his chest heaving. He slowly padded toward Genevieve, his massive paws making almost no sound. Genevieve shrank back against the cold stone, instinctively terrified of the massive beast. But the wolf didn't bare his teeth. He lowered his massive head, pressing his blood-stained snout gently against her trembling knee. A deep, soothing rumble emanated from his chest, attempting to calm her racing heart. He was checking on her. The butcher of Athelgard was making sure she was safe. Genevieve slowly reached out a trembling hand, her fingers burying into the thick, coarse fur at the nape of his neck. The giant wolf closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her frail touch. Frosthold Castle was a towering fortress of black obsidian and grey granite, carved directly into the side of a jagged mountain. It looked unyielding, merciless, and terrifying, much like its master. Upon their arrival, Genevieve was immediately swept away by the castle staff. Kaelin had state matters to attend to, leaving her in the hands of the head housekeeper, a stern older woman named Martha. While Martha was brisk, she was not cruel. However, the same could not be said for the courtiers. Frosthold was home to dozens of noble families under Kaelin's protection. When Genevieve was led through the great halls, the whispers followed her like shadows. "That is the southern trash he brought back. I hear she smells like a human, no wolf at all. Lord Reginald gave her away for free just to be rid of the burden. She will not last a week in the cold." The worst among them was Lady Beatrice, a stunningly beautiful, tall she-wolf with silver hair and piercing violet eyes. Beatrice was the daughter of Kaelin's top general. It was widely known that Beatrice intended to become the Lunar Queen of the North. That evening, a grand banquet was held in the great hall to celebrate the king's victorious return. Genevieve had been given a simple, dark blue wool dress by Martha. It was practical and warm, but hopelessly plain compared to the dazzling silk and fur gowns worn by the northern ladies. Genevieve entered the hall, her head bowed, attempting to slip unnoticed to a minor table in the back. But Lady Beatrice intercepted her, flanked by her sycophantic handmaidens. "Well, look what the king dragged in from the mud," Beatrice sneered, her voice carrying over the music of the lute players. She stepped into Genevieve's path, holding a goblet of red wine. "Tell me, Southern Mutt, do you know how to scrub cobblestones? Because our hounds make quite a mess in the kennels, and we are short on servants." Genevieve flushed deeply, her chest tightening. "I am here at the king's behest, Lady Beatrice, not as a servant." "Oh, really?" Beatrice laughed sharply. "You think you are a guest? You are a wolfless reject, a blood traitor's daughter." Beatrice deliberately tilted her wrist, pouring the dark red wine directly down the front of Genevieve's blue woolen dress. Gasps echoed around the immediate area. Genevieve stood frozen, the cold liquid seeping through to her skin. The humiliation burned hotter than a branding iron. "Oh, my apologies," Beatrice smiled wickedly. "You are so insignificant, I hardly saw you standing there." Before Genevieve could turn and flee the hall, the heavy oak doors at the front of the room slammed shut with a deafening boom. The music abruptly ceased. King Kaelin stood at the head of the hall. He had bathed and changed into formal attire. A dark velvet tunic trimmed in black fur, a silver crown resting atop his dark, unruly hair. But his eyes were fixed entirely on Genevieve, and the cold fury radiating from him was palpable. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, dropping 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Frost literally began to creep up the stone pillars. Kaelin strode across the great hall. The crowds parted instantly, terrified of his wrath. He stopped directly in front of Beatrice, towering over her. The smug smile vanished from the noblewoman's face, replaced by stark terror as her knees threatened to buckle under his alpha aura. "Lady Beatrice." Kaelin's voice was perilously quiet, echoing clearly in the dead silence of the hall. "Did your hand slip?" "My king," Beatrice stammered, bowing deeply. "It was an accident. The girl stepped in my path." "Liar!" Kalen snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. He turned to look at Genevieve's ruined dress, his jaw clenching tight enough to shatter teeth. Slowly, Kalen reached up and unfastened the heavy, magnificent clasp of his royal cloak, a cloak reserved only for the king and his Luna. With deliberate, slow movements, Kalen wrapped the royal mantle around Genevieve's small shoulders, covering the wine stain entirely. He pulled the edges together, his large, calloused hands brushing lightly against her collarbone. A jolt of pure electricity surged through Genevieve's veins at the contact, making her gasp softly. Kalen's eyes flared briefly with that same dark, untamed hunger she had seen in the woods. He turned back to the court. "Hear me," Kalen boomed, his voice reaching every corner of Frosthold. "Genevieve Hastings is under my absolute, irrevocable protection. She sits at the high table. She eats from my plate. She is no servant, and she is no burden. Anyone who disrespects her will answer to my blade." He looked directly down at Beatrice, who was trembling violently. "You will clean the kennels tomorrow, Beatrice, on your hands and knees. Perhaps it will teach you to respect your betters." The hall was entirely dumbstruck. The King of the North, the man who had never looked twice at a woman, was publicly shielding a broken southern girl. Kalen gently placed his hand on the small of Genevieve's back, guiding her toward the high table at the front of the room. Genevieve was in a state of shock, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. As she sat beside the king in the seat reserved for his queen, a sharp pain suddenly bloomed in her palm. She winced, looking down. In her panic earlier, she had gripped the edge of a rough wooden table, driving a deep splinter into her hand. A single drop of blood welled up from her skin, falling onto the dark obsidian surface of the high table. As soon as her blood touched the ancient stone, a brilliant, blinding white light flared from the point of contact. The runes carved deep into the table, dormant for 1,000 years, began to glow with blinding, silver luminescence. The entire hall erupted into chaos. Wolves shifted instinctively, panicking at the surge of ancient magic. Kalen shot up from his chair, grabbing Genevieve's bleeding hand. He stared at the glowing runes, then at the terrified girl beside him. The icy king's breath hitched, a look of profound shock and realization dawning on his scarred face. "By the goddess," Kalen breathed, his voice thick with an emotion Genevieve couldn't comprehend. He wasn't looking at a broken girl anymore. He was looking at a legend. "Your blood. You are the white lichen. The last piece." Genevieve stared at him, terrified. The warmth of his hand was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. "I don't understand. I have no wolf." "You do," Kalen whispered fiercely, pulling her close, shielding the glowing table from the prying eyes of the court with his broad body. "She is just locked away, Genevieve, and I am going to tear this world apart to set her free." The heavy obsidian doors of Kalen's private sanctuary slammed shut, sealing them away from the panicked whispers of the great hall. The royal study was a cavernous room, lined with thousands of ancient, leather-bound tomes, illuminated only by the roaring hearth at its center. Genevieve stood shivering near the fire, cradling her uninjured hand against her chest. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind. A white lichen. The legends spoke of them as myths, celestial beings chosen by the moon goddess herself to bring balance to the warring lycanthrope realms. They were said to possess magic that could heal the blighted lands and unite the packs. But she was just Genevieve, the broken, abused daughter of a disgraced house. Kalen paced the length of the Persian rug, his massive frame radiating a chaotic mixture of awe and predatory agitation. He ran a hand through his dark hair, entirely disrupting his silver crown, before finally stopping in front of her. "Show me your neck," Kalen commanded, his voice tight but completely devoid of its usual terrifying edge. It was a plea, not an order. Genevieve hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she reached up and brushed her dark, heavy hair over her shoulder, exposing the pale skin of her neck and collarbone. Kaelin stepped into her personal space. The sheer size of him, the intoxicating scent of winter pine and raw, dominant power made Genevieve's knees weak. He didn't touch her skin directly. Instead, he closed his eyes and hovered his large, calloused hand an inch above her nape, letting his alpha energy wash over her. A sharp, stinging sensation erupted at the base of her skull. Genevieve gasped, arching her back as a web of dark, bruised veins suddenly became visible beneath her translucent skin, pulsing with a sickly purple light. Kaelin's icy blue eyes snapped open, blazing with a fury so profound it made the flames in the hearth flicker and dim. "Just as I suspected," he snarled, taking a step back as if burned. "You are not wolfless, Genevieve. You have been poisoned." "Poisoned?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "By whom?" "By the very people who sold you to me," Kaelin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre. He turned and marched toward a heavy oak desk, pulling open a drawer to retrieve an ancient, crumbling map of the continent. "Look here. The southern reaches. Your stepfather, Reginald, did not simply mismanage his fortunes. He was funding the Aster Trade Guild, a front for dark warlocks who deal in illegal silver ash and wolfsbane." Genevieve approached the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Why would he do that?" "To suppress you," Kaelin explained, his eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. The Hastings family carries a dormant, ancient gene. It is tied directly to the Windsor bloodline, the original monarchs of the United Pax, centuries ago. Reginald must have realized what you were the moment you came of age. A white lycan's power threatens every corrupt lord in the south. If the Pax knew you existed, Reginald would lose all control over your estate. So, he paid the warlocks to bind your wolf using a blood seal. Tears welled in Genevieve's eyes. All the years of abuse, the starvation, the endless mockery from her stepsister Diana. It was all a calculated, torturous lie. She wasn't broken. She was a prisoner in her own body. A choked sob escaped her lips. Her legs gave out, the overwhelming weight of the betrayal finally crushing her spirit. Before she could hit the stone floor, Kaelin caught her. He pulled her against his broad chest, wrapping his powerful arms around her fragile frame. Genevieve buried her face into his velvet tunic, weeping uncontrollably. For a man known as the Butcher, his embrace was overwhelmingly gentle. He stroked her dark hair, his large hand resting protectively against the back of her head, completely shielding her from the world. "Weep tonight, little bird," Kaelin murmured into her ear, his breath warm against her temple. "Let the sorrow bleed out. But tomorrow you will dry your tears, because tomorrow we begin breaking that seal, and when your wolf finally claws her way to the surface, the South will burn for what they have done to you." Genevieve tilted her head up, looking into his pale blue eyes. The harsh, scarred face of the Alpha King was softened by a vulnerability she never expected to see. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You paid my debt. You owe me nothing." Kaelin's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a silent, burning admission, before rising back to meet her hazel eyes. "Because the moment I saw you on that auction block, chained and shivering in the mud, my wolf stopped pacing. He stopped roaring for blood." Kaelin slowly raised a hand, his thumb gently wiping away a tear from her cheek. "You are my mate, Genevieve. The goddess bound our souls long before Reginald tried to break yours, and I protect what is mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating, Her mate, the King of the North, the most feared alpha alive, was claiming the rejected runt of the South. The bond, previously suppressed by her magical binding, suddenly flared to life in Genevieve's chest. It was a terrifying, beautiful warmth that spread through her veins, fighting back the cold poison of the seal. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, finding her first true home in the hands of the monster everyone had warned her about. Winter tightened its ruthless grip on the northern territories, but the true storm was brewing inside the war room of Frosthold. 2 weeks had passed since the banquet. Under Kaelin's relentless protection and the guidance of the royal healers, Genevieve was slowly regaining her physical strength. The bruised veins on her neck were fading as Kaelin spent hours each night channeling his raw alpha energy into her, systematically breaking down the warlock's dark magic. With every layer he shattered, Genevieve felt a phantom presence growing stronger in the back of her mind, a massive, pacing entity begging to be unleashed. But peace was a luxury the North could not afford. "Alpha Dominic has crossed the Rockefeller Ridge," announced General Arthur Wellesley, a seasoned warrior with a grey beard and a face mapped with battle scars. He slammed a heavy wooden marker onto the tactical map spread across the granite table. "He has amassed a mercenary army of rogues and southern outcasts, and worse, he is heavily armed with silver-tipped weaponry." Kaelin leaned over the table, his massive shoulders tense under his dark leather armor. "How did he cross the ridge undetected? The blizzards there are lethal even to our scouts." "He had inside help, Your Majesty," Arthur replied grimly. "Someone provided him with the safe routes through the Aster mining tunnels." Genevieve, who was seated quietly in the corner of the room, felt a chill run down her spine. Kaelin had insisted she attend the War Council meetings, much to the shock of his generals. He wanted her to understand the politics of her new home, treating her not as a fragile liability, but as his equal. Kaelin's jaw clenched. A traitor in Frosthold. "It gets worse," Arthur continued, lowering his voice. "Our spies in the east intercepted a raven. Dominic knows about the white lichen. He knows about Genevieve." Silence descended upon the war room. Kaelin's pale blue eyes immediately snapped toward Genevieve. The protective possessiveness in his gaze was so intense it was almost suffocating. "Dominic has allied himself with Lord Reginald," Arthur explained, pulling out a crumpled parchment. "Reginald wants his stepdaughter back, claiming the debt settlement was fraudulent. Dominic wants the white lichen to harness her power for his own conquest. They are marching on the lower village of Oakhaven as we speak, demanding we surrender her, or they will slaughter every peasant in the valley." The wooden table splintered loudly as Kaelin gripped the edge, his claws extending and digging deep into the ancient timber. A low, demonic growl vibrated from his chest, causing the seasoned generals to instinctively take a step back. "They will die screaming," Kaelin promised, the Butcher of Aethelgard resurfacing in full force. He turned to his commander. "Rouse the vanguard. We ride at dusk. We will meet Dominic in the valley and crush his pathetic army into the permafrost." "Kaelin, wait!" Genevieve spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. She stood up from her chair, walking toward the imposing men at the table. "You cannot leave the castle undefended. If there is a traitor inside Frosthold, this could be a diversion." Kaelin stepped toward her, his expression softening only for her. "I will leave a detachment of the Royal Guard to protect you. You will be locked in the highest tower, guarded by my best men. I will not let them touch you, Genevieve." "I am not a child hiding under a bed," she argued, surprising herself with her own defiance. The presence in her mind, her wolf, was restless, feeding her a newfound courage. "If Dominic wants me, let me stand on the battlements. Let them see that I am not afraid." Kaelin reached out, cupping her face with both hands. "You are brave, little bird, braver than any southern lord, but your wolf is not fully free yet. You are vulnerable. Please, let me fight this war for you." Reluctantly, Genevieve nodded, though a deep sense of dread settled in her stomach. By nightfall, Kaelin and the massive northern vanguard had ridden out, their black banners disappearing into the blinding snowstorm. Frosthold grew eerily quiet, the grand halls echoing with tension. Genevieve remained in the royal chambers, pacing the floor. The fireplace cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Suddenly, a strange sound caught her attention, a muffled thump from the hallway, followed by the heavy clatter of armor hitting the ground. Her heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the heavy oak doors and pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Slowly she turned the iron handle and pulled the door open a fraction. The 2 royal guards assigned to protect her were slumped on the floor, darts embedded in their necks. Standing over them, holding a silver-plated crossbow, was Lady Beatrice. Beatrice looked up, her violet eyes flashing with malicious triumph. Flanking her were 4 massive, scarred mercenaries wearing Dominic's eastern colours. "I told you, southern mutt," Beatrice sneered, stepping over the unconscious guards. "You would not last the winter." Genevieve stumbled backward into the room, her breathing shallow and frantic. "You betrayed your king. You betrayed the North." "I am saving the North from a weak, wolfless queen," Beatrice spat, aiming the crossbow directly at Genevieve's chest. "When Kaelin returns and finds you gone, he will see that you were nothing but a liability. Dominic promised me the lunar crown once he crushes Kaelin's forces. Now, grab her." The 4 mercenaries lunged into the room, drawing silver chains. Panic, raw and absolute, flooded Genevieve's veins. But as the first mercenary grabbed her arm, his bruising grip mirroring the abuse she had suffered at Reginald's hands, the panic suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by an inferno. The dark magic seal binding her soul shattered with a sound like breaking glass, echoing in her own mind. Genevieve threw her head back and screamed. But it wasn't a human scream. It was a roar that rattled the very foundations of Frosthold Castle. A blinding, ethereal silver light exploded from her body, throwing the mercenaries backward against the stone walls. The heat in the room spiked dramatically. Beatrice dropped her crossbow, shielding her eyes from the blinding radiance. Genevieve's bones snapped and realigned with terrifying speed. There was no pain, only an overwhelming, euphoric sense of absolute freedom. The frail, bruised human girl vanished, replaced by something magnificent and terrifying. Standing in the center of the royal chambers was a monstrous direwolf. She was larger than any normal lichen, her fur a pristine, glowing white that seemed to weave moonlight into its strands. Her eyes were pools of molten liquid gold. The white lichen had awoken. The mercenaries scrambled to their feet, drawing their silver broadswords, but they were trembling. Genevieve didn't wait. She lunged. She moved with blinding speed, a streak of white lightning. With one swipe of her massive paw, she sent 2 mercenaries crashing through the heavy oak doors, their armor crumpling like tin. She spun, snapping her jaws around the silver sword of the 3rd man, shattering the lethal metal into harmless shards before throwing him against the fireplace. Beatrice, paralyzed with absolute terror, backed into a corner, sinking to her knees. The magnificent white wolf slowly turned toward the treacherous noblewoman. Genevieve bared her teeth, a low, rumbling growl shaking the floorboards. She didn't kill Beatrice. The traitor's fate belonged to the king. Instead, she released a booming, deafening howl, a call to her mate that cut through the howling blizzard, carrying across the mountains to warn the winter wolf that his home was under siege. 10 leagues south of Frosthold, the northern vanguard sat mounted in a dead, frozen gorge. The howling wind whipped snow into their faces, but the valley below was entirely empty. There was no mercenary army. There were no southern banners. King Caelan sat atop his massive black destrier, his pale blue eyes narrowing into slits against the driving sleet. Beside him, General Arthur Wellesley lowered his spyglass, his gruff face pale. "The scouts were wrong, Your Majesty," Arthur shouted over the gale, "or they were silenced. Dominic is not here." Before Caelan could issue the order to wheel the cavalry around, a sound ripped through the very fabric of the night. It was a howl, but unlike any lichen call the northern warriors had ever heard. It was melodic, terrifyingly pure, and resonated with a sheer, ancient magic that made the blood of every wolf in the vanguard run hot. It was a sound of unyielding dominance wrapped in desperate warning. Caelan clutched his chest as a blinding, searing heat erupted over his heart. The mating bond, previously a dull, comforting hum, suddenly roared to life like a wildfire doused in kerosene. He could feel her. He could feel her raw, unbridled power, her terror, and her sudden, magnificent fury. "Frosthold," Caelan roared, his voice a demonic register that sent his war horse rearing onto its hind legs. The Butcher of Ethelgard shed his human facade entirely, his eyes bleeding into absolute pitch black. "They bypassed the gorge. They are at the castle. Ride. Ride until your beasts collapse." Back within the obsidian walls of the fortress, the white lichen was a tempest of silver and gold. Genevieve did not flee into the night as a coward would. Guided by the protective instincts of her newly awakened beast, she bounded through the stone corridors of Frosthold. The castle was in pandemonium. Infiltrators wearing Dominic's eastern colours were dragging terrified servants from their quarters. At the entrance to the lower kitchens, Genevieve found Martha, the stern head housekeeper, backed against a wall by 3 armed rogues. The men raised their silver-tipped axes, laughing cruelly at the defenceless older woman. A thunderous snarl echoed through the vaulted stone ceiling. Before the rogues could turn, a blur of radiant white fur collided with them. Genevieve clamped her massive jaws around the lead rogue's armor, crushing the steel plate like parchment, and tossed him across the room into a row of oak barrels. She whipped her body around, her thick, powerful tail knocking the legs out from under the second man, while a single, heavy strike from her paw shattered the third rogue's weapon into useless splinters. She stood over the trembling Martha, her golden eyes blazing with ethereal fire. The white wolf nudged the housekeeper gently with her blood-stained snout, urging her toward the hidden passageways of the crypts, but her heroics had drawn attention. "There she is!" a voice barked from the main courtyard. It was Lord Dominic himself, standing tall in his polished silver armor, flanked by 50 of his most elite mercenaries, and standing beside him, grinning like a madman, was a familiar face that made Genevieve's golden eyes narrow with pure, undiluted hatred. Reginald, her stepfather. "Incredible," Reginald breathed, clutching a heavy iron chain. The rumors were true. Lord Richard Branson of the Southern Ports warned me she was hiding a fortune in magic, but to see it, she is worth a kingdom in the underground markets. "She is mine to break, Reginald," Dominic sneered. He raised a hand, signaling his men. "Bring out the heavy nets. Do not kill her. I want her alive to breed the next generation of my army." Genevieve stalked out into the snow-covered courtyard, baring her teeth. The sheer aura of the white lichen made several of Dominic's men stagger backward, clutching their chests. But there were too many of them. Dozens of mercenaries hurled massive, heavy nets woven with pure silver threads. Genevieve dodged the first 2, leaping with impossible grace over a swinging broadsword, but a third net caught her hind legs. The silver burned upon contact with her pure white coat, searing her flesh. She roared in pain, collapsing into the freezing mud. More nets piled atop her, pinning the magnificent beast to the ground. Dominic drew a heavy, rune-carved broadsword, stepping confidently toward the trapped white lichen. "A beautiful beast," he mocked, raising the blade to strike her shoulder and disable her entirely, but still just a beast. He never finished his sentence. The heavy, reinforced iron gates of Frosthold didn't just open, they exploded inward. Shards of metal and splintered wood rained down upon Dominic's men like deadly shrapnel. From the smoke and swirling blizzard emerged a nightmare. Calen Blackwood had not even waited for his vanguard. He had shifted miles away and run the distance, driven by a violent, unholy rage. The Black Wolf was gargantuan, easily dwarfing Genevieve, his fur bristling with static electricity and raw, murderous intent. When Calen saw his mate pinned beneath the burning silver nets, the sound he made was not a howl. It was the roar of a falling mountain. The slaughter that followed would be etched into the histories of the lycanthrope realms for 1,000 years. Calen did not fight like a king. He fought like a demon unchained. He tore through the mercenary ranks with blinding speed, a vortex of shadow and blood. Men screamed, their silver weapons glancing harmlessly off Calen's magically fortified black coat. He grabbed the captain of the guard in his massive jaws and threw him over the battlements into the icy abyss below. The vanguard poured into the courtyard moments later, cutting off any hope of retreat for Dominic's forces. Genevieve watched through the gaps in the silver mesh as her mate systematically dismantled an entire army for her. The sheer devotion in his brutality was awe-inspiring. Dominic, realizing his catastrophic miscalculation, attempted to shift and flee. But Calen was upon him in a heartbeat. The Black Wolf pinned the Eastern Alpha to the cobblestones, his massive paw pressing down on Dominic's chest with enough force to crack his ribcage. Calen shifted back into his human form, completely naked, completely covered in blood, and utterly terrifying. He summoned his broadsword from a fallen guard. "You brought silver to my home," Calen whispered, his icy eyes completely devoid of mercy. "You touched my queen. Your bloodline ends tonight." With one swift, brutal arc, Calen separated Dominic's head from his shoulders. The remaining mercenaries dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in absolute surrender. The courtyard fell dead silent, save for the howling wind and the crackle of the burning torches. Calen ignored the surrendered men. He ignored his generals. He immediately dropped his sword and rushed to the center of the courtyard, falling to his knees beside the silver nets. Ignoring the agonizing burns the silver inflicted upon his own bare hands, the Alpha King ripped the heavy mesh apart, tossing it aside to free the white lichen. Genevieve lay panting in the snow, her white fur singed and stained with her own blood. Calen gently cradled her massive lupine head in his arms, his scarred face twisted in agony. "I have you," Calen murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. "I am here, my beautiful girl. You are safe." Slowly, the blinding silver light enveloped Genevieve once more. She shifted back into her human form. She was entirely naked, shivering, and covered in silver burns, but she had never looked more radiant. Calen instantly unclasped a heavy fur cloak from General Arthur and wrapped it tightly around her, lifting her into his protective embrace. "Well, well, well," a trembling, pathetic voice echoed near the supply wagons. Calen turned his icy glare. General Arthur held Reginald by the scruff of his neck. The Southern Lord was a blubbering mess, realizing he was trapped behind enemy lines with the very man he had tried to swindle. "King Calen," Reginald begged, dropping to his knees in the blood-soaked snow. "I had nothing to do with this. Dominic forced me. Please, I am her father." Genevieve rested her head against Calen's solid chest. The Alpha King looked down at her, silently asking for her command. She was no longer a commodity to be bought and sold. She was the white lichen. Genevieve looked at the man who had starved her, beaten her, and sold her for 3 copper coins. She felt no rage, only a profound, hollow pity. "You are no father of mine," Genevieve said, her voice magically amplified by her newly awakened power, echoing across the quiet courtyard. "Take him to the deepest cell in the crypts. Let him rot in the cold he so desperately wanted me to die in. And send word to the southern reaches, the Hastings estate now belongs to the Northern Crown." Reginald sobbed as the royal guards dragged him away into the darkness. Beatrice, who had been found cowering in the royal chambers, was stripped of her noble titles and banished to the barren wastelands of the far north, forced to survive as a rogue without a pack. A month later, the first signs of spring touched the harsh northern mountains. The great hall of Frosthold was unrecognizable. Gone was the grim, oppressive darkness. Instead, the ancient obsidian stones practically hummed with warm, ambient magic. The presence of the white lichen had shattered the perpetual winter. Flowers bloomed in the castle courtyards for the first time in a century, and the rivers flowed free of ice. Genevieve stood before the grand mirror in the royal chambers, dressed in a breathtaking gown of spun silver and white velvet. A delicate crown of woven frost iron rested upon her dark hair. Her skin was flawless, her scars entirely healed by her wolf's magic. Two massive, calloused hands gently rested on her waist from behind. Kaelin pressed a soft kiss to the crook of her neck, right over the mating mark he had proudly claimed the week prior. "The lords of the continent are waiting in the throne room," Kaelin murmured, his voice rumbling against her skin. "They have come to pledge fealty, not just to me, but to you." Genevieve turned in his arms, looking up into the pale blue eyes of the Butcher of Ethelgard. The ice in his gaze had melted entirely, leaving behind a burning, bottomless ocean of devotion. "Are you ready to share your throne, my king?" she teased, reaching up to trace the jagged scar on his jaw. Kaelin caught her hand, pressing a fervent kiss to her palm. "I was a dead man, ruling a frozen wasteland before you arrived, Genevieve. The throne was always yours. I was merely keeping it warm for you." Hand in hand, the Alpha King and the White Queen walked out of the chambers to greet their new, united world. The girl they had sold for 3 coppers had not just survived the winter. She had become the dawn, and that is the epic tale of Genevieve, the discarded southern runt who became the most powerful lunar queen the lycanthrope world had ever seen, and Kaelin, the cold-hearted Alpha King whose frozen soul could only be thawed by the very girl everyone else threw away. Their story proves that true worth isn't determined by the price tag others put on you, but by the fire that burns within your own spirit. And sometimes, the greatest monsters in the legends are simply waiting for the right person to protect. If this story of betrayal, fierce loyalty, and ultimate revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with your fellow fantasy and romance lovers so they can experience the journey of the white lichen. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more breathtaking, dramatic stories brought to life. Let me know in the comments below. What would you have done to Reginald? See you in the next tale.